Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We are going to be tackling something I know a lot of you have been hearing about: woke entertainment.
Yeah, it's everywhere, right? I mean, we've got a whole stack of articles right here, and let me tell you, there are some strong opinions out there. Some are praising it, some are criticizing it, and then there are those stuck in the middle, just trying to figure out what it all means. So to help us unpack it all, we've got our expert here. Welcome. So glad to have you with us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me. Always happy to dive into a good conversation.
Right. And this is definitely a hot topic.
Yeah, woke has definitely become a bit of a loaded term.
For sure. So maybe let's start with the definition. What do we even mean when we say woke entertainment?
Right. Well, at its heart, it's about representation. It's about reflecting the diversity of our world on screen and behind the scenes.
Makes sense.
So it's not just about seeing people from different backgrounds in movies and shows and games. It's also about who's creating those stories. Okay, now let's get into some specifics, because we've seen a ton of examples in the news lately, especially with some of these casting choices.
Definitely.
Disney's been in the spotlight a lot, what with Halle Bailey as Ariel and Rachel Zegler cast as Snow White.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been a lot of praise for the inclusivity, but also some pushback from those who feel like it's departing from the original stories too much. So is this the classic case of tradition versus representation? Or is there more to it?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it feels like this tension is playing out everywhere these days.
Right.
Like, it's not just Disney. Take Star Wars 7, for example. Casting John Boyega and Kelly Marie Tran was huge in terms of representation,
Sure.
but some fans felt like it didn't quite fit with the rest of the Star Wars universe, like it was out of place somehow.
And that kind of gets to the heart of what a lot of these articles are talking about, right?
That was so...
Well, they use words like shoehorned in or pandering
Yeah.
to describe how diversity is sometimes handled. Like, it's not really integral to the story,
Yeah.
you know?
Right. It's like checking a box rather than telling an authentic story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we tell the difference? How can we tell when it's genuine versus when it feels forced?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? I think it comes down to this idea of tokenism.
Tokenism.
Yeah, it's the difference between just including diverse faces and actually making those experiences central to the narrative.
Okay, I like that.
Like Black Panther is a great example of how powerful it can be when it's done well.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't just about having a Black superhero. It was this incredible celebration of Afrofuturism and Black culture. It felt so fully realized.
Exactly. It felt natural, like it was always meant to be that way.
Right, and when studios just try to check boxes, audiences can feel that. It just doesn't land the same way.
So how do we get to more of that authenticity, that natural, organic feeling? A lot of these articles talked about needing more diversity behind the camera, not just in front of it. Is that a big part of the solution? Well, I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, if you have more people from different backgrounds writing, directing, producing, then the stories themselves will naturally be more diverse.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just about, like, adding diversity as an afterthought, it's about having those voices and perspectives shape the story from the very beginning. So, I mean, look at Crazy Rich Asians, right? That movie was huge.
Oh, yeah, right,
And
right.
a big part of what made it so successful was that it had a predominantly Asian creative team.
Right.
And they brought this incredible authenticity and nuance to the story, something that I think resonated with audiences all over the world.
But it sparked a much bigger conversation, too, I remember, about representation in Hollywood.
Totally. And it's not just happening in film. We're seeing this push for more inclusive storytelling in video games, too.
Oh,
Like Overwatch and Life is Strange, these games have gotten so much praise for having diverse casts and telling these really interesting and inclusive stories.
yeah, for sure.
When what I think is really cool is how they've even woven inclusivity into the mechanics of the games themselves.
Oh, interesting.
Right, so it's not just about seeing yourself represented on screen, it's about how you experience the game world itself,
Yeah, I get that.
It's about feeling truly seen and heard.
You know, it's funny because we've been talking about studios and creators, but there's also been this really interesting shift in how audiences are engaging with this stuff too, especially with the rise of fandom culture online.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, a lot of these articles talked about how fans are becoming more vocal in demanding better representation in the stories they love.
It's true. Social media has given fans such a powerful platform, and it can be a really good thing
Totally.
because it holds creators accountable. But at the same time, it can also be a double-edged sword.
How so?
Well, because what one group celebrates, another group might criticize, right? It can be really polarizing.
Well, for sure. Look at what happened with the all-female Ghostbusters.
Exactly. People had very strong feelings about that.
Understatement of the year. But it's interesting, right? Because it feels like there's this constant tension between staying true to the original spirit of something while also making it relevant for a new generation.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a tough balance to strike.
It really is.
Because there's no magic formula,
Right.
right? What works for one story might not work for another.
Right.
But I think it comes down to this. When inclusivity feels like it's truly a part of the story, like it just emerges naturally from the characters and the world, that's when it really sings.
Makes sense.
But when it feels forced or like it's just an afterthought, it sticks out like a sore thumb.
It's all about being authentic.
Exactly.
So it's not just about who's on screen, it's about how their stories are told, right?
100%. And I think A League of Their Own is a really good example of this. Yeah, so you've got the classic film and then the more recent series, right?
Yeah.
And they both feature women playing baseball, but the series goes a lot deeper, I think.
In what way?
Well, it explores these really complex issues around gender and race and sexuality,
Okay.
and it does it in a way that feels very relevant to audiences today. You know, it's not about erasing the past, it's about adding to it, you know, bringing in these new layers of complexity and nuance.
I like that.
Because the world is complicated, right? Our stories should reflect that.
I agree. And to really capture that complexity, don't you need a certain level of empathy and understanding? Especially when you're telling stories about experiences that might be different from your own.
100%. I mean, it's about doing the research, right?
Hey.
Listening to diverse voices, approaching these stories with sensitivity and respect.
Yeah, for sure.
And that goes for both creators and audiences, I think.
Yeah.
Like, we need to be open to having our perspectives challenged, to learning from stories that are different from our own.
That's a good point. And it's interesting because, you know, one of the criticisms you hear sometimes about woke entertainment is that it can feel preachy.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Like it's trying to push an agenda instead of just telling a good story.
Right, right.
So how do you navigate that line
Actually,
between raising awareness and
Yeah.
just telling a compelling story?
it's a tightrope walk, isn't it?
For sure.
And I think creators have been wrestling with this forever. It's not a new problem.
Right.
But again, for me, it always comes back to authenticity.
There's that word again.
Right. Like when a story comes from a place of genuine empathy and understanding, even if it's fictional, even if it's a superhero movie or a fantasy novel, it can have this incredible power to change hearts and minds.
Because you can't really have a real conversation about something if you're tiptoeing around all the hard stuff, you know.
Right, exactly. And some of the most powerful art, the most impactful stories, they've always challenged the way we see the world, you know. They've pushed boundaries, they've made people uncomfortable, and that's how we grow, right?
For sure. It makes me think of that quote, what's it? Art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable, or something like that.
Yes, love that one.
I feel like that really applies to this whole conversation we're having.
100%, because it speaks to the power of stories, you
Mhm.
know? They can both reflect our culture and they can change it.
It's true. And when you see yourself reflected in those stories, especially stories that haven't always been told, it's like really powerful.
Totally. It validates your experiences. It makes you feel seen.
Exactly. And on the flip side, when you encounter stories that are really different from your own, it can open your mind to new ways of seeing the world.
That's what it's all about, right? Expanding our understanding, building empathy.
And that brings us back to you, dear listener, because we've covered a lot of ground here today.
We have.
We've talked about representation, tokenism, the importance of diversity behind the scenes, this whole evolving relationship between creators and audiences.
Yeah, lots to unpack.
So as you go out there and you watch these movies and play these games, what sticks with you?
What resonates? What challenges you?
And maybe most importantly, what makes you think? Because at the end of the day, isn't that what we're all looking for? Stories that stay with us, that make us see the world a little differently.
Absolutely. And I think this whole woke debate, it's really just a small part of a much bigger conversation, you know,
About what?
about how we tell stories, whose stories get told, and how those stories shape our understanding of the world.
And those are conversations that I think are going to keep evolving.
For sure. And we need to be a part of them, both as creators and as audiences.
Couldn't agree more. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep having those conversations.
Exactly.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive, but thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all of you listening out there, thanks for diving in with us. Until next time.